and stay standing for a moment of silence afterward to honor those men and women serving both this country and abroad. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, thank you. What are you doing, Jude, tonight? Okay, we'll work on that. All right, good evening and welcome everybody to the, whatever day of the week, June 5th Planning Board meeting. I'm new here, so excuse me for my first meeting tonight. I'd like to introduce the board to begin with. To my left, I have Richard Cottagio. To my right, Sandra Biglione. To Joe Bigliano. Biglino, close enough. And then we have Richard Cottagio at the very end.
No, Rob Answer.
Rob, oh my God.
Calm down.
Deep breath for tonight.
And then Gail Lombard.
Gail, our secretary. Council, Richard Golden. Dennis Lindsay, village engineer. Jonathan Lockman, planning. And John Collins from traffic. With the introductions out of the way, has the board had a chance to review the minutes from our last meeting?
Yes.
Can I get a motion to accept those
Make
minutes?
that motion.
I'll second.
On the question? All in favor?
Aye. I don't know if Rob says so.
All right, on to our regular agenda items. First item on the agenda, Pine Ridge Estates. Extension request of preliminary approval for 6-lot subdivision located off Scudamonk Road in Highland Mills and known on tax maps as sections 213, block 1, lots 4 and 5. We have a representative from the applicant here tonight. Yeah. Come up to the podium and state your name, please.
I don't think that's on.
Is that a, yeah, we have the green light?
It's the button on the bottom.
Asher Horowitz,
Okay, and you're in front of the board for tonight for?
an extension for the preliminary approvals for Pine Ridge Estates.
Okay. We have had some correspondence from our council on this. Do you want me to read yours, or do you want to go over?
However you want to do it, Mr. Chairman.
I can do it. Before we move forward with granting or not granting any extensions, we've been asked that you get on file with the building department an owner's authorization from the present owner, 40C Scudamonk LLC. Because right now we do not have you listed, and correct me if I'm wrong, listed as able to talk on behalf of the owner of the property, correct?
That's right. As with any applicant who's not the owner needs to give approval that you're coming before them and you're doing so with their approval so that somebody doesn't come up and say they want to put something on a stranger's property. You had an owner's authorization when the owner was Turner and Gold. The owner is no longer Turner and Gold, as you know.
Correct.
Right. So the present owner, which is 406, I think, Scudamonk, LLC, you need an owner authorization from them, from the member for you to proceed and for the board really to take any significant action. You also will need to file the county's required form with the building department here, identifying the members of the LLC. You can get that form from the building department as well. And so what I'm suggesting to the board is right now, Ashley, who's been before you for a while, so this is really an oversight, I think, but one that needs to be corrected. My suggestion is that the board continue it for a short period of time to allow Mr. Horowitz to go ahead and get the necessary owner's authorization and the LLC form submitted, and then you can deal with it more substantively with respect to considering a longer extension of time.
I can do that immediately.
So if the board was in favor of giving you an extension to our next meeting, would that be enough time for you to get the required paperwork?
Yes.
And then I can make sure you're on that agenda and we can just go forward
Check.
from there.
What's the next date?
June 19th?
Yes.
Yeah, June 19th.
Yes.
Can I get a motion to offer an extension for Pine Ridge Estates until June 19th?
I'll make the motion.
Can I get a second?
I'll second.
Any questions?
The only thing for Mr. Horowitz, the materials will have to be submitted to the attorney a week before?
They should be submitted to the building department.
Right.
And that, you're supposed to submit them a week before. Can you get it a week before?
Yes.
Okay.
So again, I need the LLC papers and approval and the
There's an owner.
members of that.
There's an owner authorization form and an LLC form. You should get both of those from the building department, fill them out, and bring them back to the building department a week before the 19th.
No problem. Thank you.
I have the motion, the second. All in favor?
Aye.
All right, thank you very much, sir.
Good night.
Okay, next item on the agenda, Weiss Apple Hill. Discuss ARB review of proposed single-family home located at 26 Apple Hill Drive in Highland Mills. This property is designated as a critical environmental area pursuant to SEQA and subject to the village regulations for ridge preservations 310-13. Said property is known as on the Village of Woodbury tax maps, section 204, block 2, lot 2. Is the applicant here?
What happened to it? Oh, yeah.
This is new submission.
There's no cubicle counts, just footprint. That's what we want.
Good evening, gentlemen. How are you guys today?
Good evening. My name's Barry Terrick. I'm the architect for the applicant. And this is Joe Mann. He's part of the design team.
I know unfortunately, I was not here at the last meeting when you guys had the back and forth, but I did review the minutes. I know you guys said you were going to take some time, come back with an updated drawing, an updated building for us, and so let's go through what's changed from prior to tonight.
Right. I think just quickest of summaries. The debate at the last meeting was we were trying to come to an agreement on a footprint size for a proposed residence that the board would be able to entertain and hopefully find acceptable for proposal based on the previous proposals that were deemed to be too large, both in square footage and footprint and in length of house. So what I have here, and which was submitted, is a house that is, I think, on 0.1% currently over what we had discussed at the last meeting, which, if I remember, was a 5,000 square foot footprint. There was debate as to what percentage increase from the house across the street would be acceptable, 10%, 11%, 13, 13.5. We went through a whole bunch of things, and I think there was a consensus for a 5,000 square foot footprint, inclusive of the garage. So that's the proposal you have before you. It came to 5,043. Hopefully, yeah, the board will be okay. If not, that can be adjusted. But it's still a one-story ranch house. A lot of room has been extracted from the previous plans, obviously. In terms of its width, again, it's been compared to the house across the street frequently. That house is 107 feet long, that house end to end, fully exposed on the street level. This proposal here is 106, down in the hill, well, with vegetation in front of it. So I'm thinking that would be an acceptable width for the house. So that's what was submitted, and we're hoping the board finds it acceptable.
You guys good?
Yeah.
Okay. Rich? Comments, questions, concerns on the
Yeah,
dated?
again, just for clarification from the last meeting, the version 1, is that the front or the back of the house we're looking at?
That's the front, you're looking from the
No,
street.
the top picture.
Yep, you're looking from the street.
Okay, and then on the second page, you have the garage, the two-car garage?
Going in the
Is
side.
that, where is that?
Going on the
That's
side.
behind here, that's the side entry garage. If you look at the floor plan, you'll see a little bump out on the front. I can come show you if you like. There's this little bump out right here,
That's the window.
which is that bay right there. So that's.
I missed
side.
one meeting too, but I thought we asked, because of the size of the house, for the garage to be relocated to the back, or am I wrong?
I think it was to the side, the opening was
The
going
side?
to be on the
Yeah,
side.
I will explain that. I remember that discussing that the last meeting. The main point was that the width of the house was much wider, and all identified that the garage as the problem, sticking out more from making the width of the building more wider. So basically, we squeezed the building in. Now the garage is bumped in basically into the building, so that's basically reducing the width of the building to keeping it the same as or a little less than the house across the street.
Okay, and then the third page, does the 5,000 include the 3 bedrooms? Is there 3 bedrooms on the,
On the basement level.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's part of the 5,000?
No.
no, it was a 5,000 footprint perimeter.
So what's the purpose of the sheet number 3? Are we approving something as a finished area, or what is the purpose of page 3? Is it, normally if it's unfinished, we don't get something with bedrooms, unless I'm wrong.
Missing the point.
From what I see, it was talked about as a 2-bedroom house, so now there's, what I understand here in the documents is there's 3 bedrooms in the lower level, there's 1 master bedroom, and there's a nursery. So I think it's 5 bedrooms.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay. So the 3 bedrooms in the basement, that's part of the finished area that you're counting the 5,000?
No.
Then I'm a little confused. Are we approving anything to do with the bedrooms or not? If it's not part of the 5,000, why are we even looking at it? I'm curious.
Well, typically, when you look at a house, they show you what the floor plan is inside. You get some indication of it. It would involve a septic system, would be designed based upon the number of bedrooms.
Right?
So you have to have some realistic count of bedrooms so that you can design a septic system. Beyond that, I think that you're looking at ARB. This is ARB. So you're looking at the visual aspects. We talked about ARB. ARB really involves whether it's dissimilar, whether it's too similar, whether it's dissimilar. It involves the appearance of the structure, the colors, and it also involves cubicle content. We've talked about that a number of times. I mean, those are the basic criteria. Now, the other things give you an idea what the house is being used for, but basically you're looking at the exterior and how it fits into the neighborhood now. Those aspects that they're talking about, the number of bedrooms, will involve engineering in terms of septic system, but that's not really what's before you now. What's before you now is the ARB and the criteria for the ARB review.
Okay. So it's not part of the I just want to make sure, it's not part of the finished area that if we do approve the 5,043, it's not part of the finished area. That's my point.
The 5,000 is basically the footprint of the perimeter of the backs of the building of the site.
Yeah, I understand that.
So,
Regardless of finish, like the garage, I don't know if we consider that finished space.
No.
No.
Right, but that's included in the 5,000, so my point is the number is not about finished space.
Okay.
Well, the
Okay.
5,043 square feet is a footprint.
correct.
That's just a footprint. There is a basement level,
Yeah.
and there's another level There's also windows upstairs. Is that an open atrium, or is there anything upstairs in the second
You know
floor?
what, that window up there is literally just for aesthetics on the house itself, so it wasn't a massive siding. There is a way to go up to the second floor for a balcony. That's literally all it is that we've always had that looks over into the living room. It's a two-story living room. So
Okay.
it's the look that the house was based on from day one, and that's all that's up there. No rooms, no finished space, no anything.
All right, so again, I'm looking back what we've done in the past, and if an applicant wants to finish either something in the basement or something in the attic, they would normally go to the building inspector, correct?
That's correct. The only thing that comes into play, and I'll just mention this, it doesn't come into play here, is that you've had people that say they're going to put a full basement in an office building.
Yeah.
And the concern is that that may affect the parking, which is a part of your responsibility in terms of if they put offices in the basement, then it affects the parking count. So you have restricted the basement, for example, in one that just recently came up on Corporate Drive, to the storage of materials for the uses on the upper floors where you accounted for the parking. And that's the only use that could be provided in the basement other than utilities. And that was based upon your responsibility for reviewing site plans. This is a single-family home. This doesn't pertain.
Okay.
Right, they could put a bowling alley in the basement. It has no bearing. We're just here to look at what the house looks like in the neighborhood, and if this house is going to fit in with the demographics of the rest of the neighborhood, then they could put a sharp in there.
But I think
I'm
we're,
sorry.
No, I'm good.
You're good? Cindy?
I'm sorry, I think where Rich is coming from is our discussion was on that table of houses, and the largest house, that 4963, included a finished basement.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, what you're
Yeah.
talking about.
Yeah,
If they're finishing the basement, does that increase the 5,043?
It doesn't increase what they have defined. They have defined
Right.
that as a footprint only, and
Right.
that's all
I
that
understand
that means. I think that that's why we got into cubicle content,
Right.
so that you could compare the size, the overall appearance and size of a structure to another structure. They did their best to guesstimate what the cubicle content was of 13 Apple Hill across the street.
Right.
I don't have anything on this building for cubicle content.
I
don't know if you
believe
did it.
it's quite similar to the difference in square footage. Like we have the other footprint is, I don't remember the number. I'm talking about the footprint is about 44 or 4,800, something like
For
that.
13 Apple Hill, it's 4426.
4426, we increased to 5,000. So I would say the cubicle content is basically the same percentage increase, because, or even less if we had the discussion, if we are counting the exposure or what is underground, it will be much even less than that.
That would all depend on roof lines, peaks.
Correct. We
you
have similar pitches. Everything is the same concept.
I don't know. Okay.
Yeah. Just to clarify, we had that discussion like that there is all kind of different points how to look like the cubicle count and everything. So we decided to simplify that at the last meeting. The board decided to look on the footprint, and that will make a determination to clarify which, how to compare it with the house across the street. So we follow that.
I understand the need or the desire to use scientific method to make an aesthetic judgment. I don't know if they're measuring so well. Basically you have, what for the most part is a one-story house here,
Right.
as opposed to the two-story that's across the street, fully two-story. That, even with the contour drop, seriously diminishes, the impact this house has on the public view.
And the berm that's in the front, that would still, none of that would change, right? So all that stuff we talked about in the past.
Correct.
Okay.
What's the height of the building?
I can tell you in a second.
Is it over 35 feet?
No, it wasn't ever.
No, it's all,
And it's, yeah, it's not all
Dennis, do you know the height of the building?
He doesn't have that listed on the drawing.
Okay.
And the height of the building, you can look at the overall peak height, which is always interesting, but then there's the height definition in the code, and on a slope roof,
Wait,
it's usually
architect rule?
the average and the mean height, so.
I don't remember, is it rigid?
Well, it has
No, it's a mean
29.
height.
This drawing says 2910, but it's an older drawing. I don't know.
It's only me, well, what if we?
I'm sorry, the ridge.
It's the mean, but I think you should give the ridge as well.
Okay, so I'm going to call this the mean right here, just a discussion. 23 and a half?
But doesn't the grade drop behind the house?
Yes, it does.
Was that part of the mean calculation or not?
Well, I'd have to take all fours if you want an accurate number.
Building height is defined as the approach to the house, okay? So if it falls off in the back, that generally doesn't come into it. I think it's based on fire apparatus, so it's the approach to the house. At least I think that's what, but anyway, that's what the code requires.
Ridge is about 33.
Yeah, in Woodbury, the base point for the, where you start to measure the height is where the fire apparatus axis is.
I'm sorry,
I'm not.
Joe.
I don't know, I'm coming late to the party, so it's kind of hard.
Just
Well, the-
one, just following up on the height aspect to satisfy people. Even if by some mistake or something, you would approve a structure that would be under the definition of the code, not allowed. That doesn't mean that your approval will prevail, right? So if you gave your approval to this, for instance, and when Gary does the calculation, it's actually 2 feet above what is the calculation for the maximum height, they would not get a building permit for it, all right? So it's the code that controls. You try to apply the code, but if in fact there's some mistake being made, what I'm saying is that's never held against you. The code is always going to prevail.
Yes, I see a long hallway that goes from the bedrooms on the basement level. Is that a hallway that goes into the garage area?
No, right on the first floor.
But in the basement level, there's a doorway to a hallway,
Right.
all right? And it goes all the way down to near stairs.
Take a look.
Looks like the pantry and the laundry area.
Right.
You could go down by the pantry and then walk all the way through that hallway to the downstairs bedroom.
There's no finish.
Okay, so everything that surrounds that is slabs, or is it a crawl space?
In my mind, and due to the drop off in the back, it's just it's unfinished space,
It's full height, unfinished space?
Yes.
Oh, I thought we said we were gonna have that on slabs, that basement level. That would be
Only under the
slabs.
garage.
Might be slab, but full height ceiling, I think is what it's.
The only portion where it's slabs is basically under the garage, is unexcavated. 'Cause that's basically, you don't want to have to support cars, car load in your basement. But the other piece is basically the grade is dropping off, so naturally you have a basement there.
And I just had another question. Originally, I think last July, the plans showed 8 bedrooms, and then we went to 2, and now we're up to now 5. Is that the final calculation? Because it's been jumping around.
Pending approval, it's the final calculation.
Yeah, we started with a 10,000 square feet footprint, and we changed a lot of stuff. So this is basically, according to the guidelines from the last meeting, this is our final plan. Yeah.
3 bathrooms downstairs too. And the 3 bathrooms downstairs too.
Right, and I believe if they did want to go back and put any more finished space in the basement, they would need to follow the necessary procedures and go through Gary's office to get the proper permits and stuff like that. So I mean, it's not really into our purview to get into what they're putting down there. Just that, Dave. I want to say thank you to the applicant for sharpening your pencils and, really coming back with, much more design based on the feedback from this board.
I appreciate it, but by way of, I'm not sure what the discussion would be. For the point of discussion, option 2, and I guess let me sit here from your position, I'm assuming you can see both these.
Can you talk into the microphone?
This is the one we're reviewing.
Right.
No question. There's a second option there. That's a different size. And I guess the question would be, do you see, these are totally equivalent scale size everything, you see the fronts are the exact same. You know, is there an appreciable difference that you see between the two?
Well, there was no option 1 or 2 submitted. We only-
This is for the sake of discussion at the moment.
Basically, the interior layout is slightly different. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm asking.
Oh, yes.
I mean, is this a test for the board?
Yeah, I get, at the
No,
moment,
well,
yeah.
the thing
Well,
is,
it's hard to do it from this distance.
yeah, and I'm really not going to allow the planning board to go ahead
Yeah, I
and
can't
talk about such a hypothetical when you haven't submitted that for them to compare it.
Okay.
Any other members of the board have any questions with submission, I guess we'll call submission version 1 that has been submitted to us?
Version 1.
Question I have for you, the ARB application that was submitted on January 4th, would any of that be changing as far as siding colors, roof colors?
No.
Okay, so then we'll still be the same. Rich, now that it's a different submission, would we need another public hearing because the building's changed, or?
No, the whole purpose of having public hearings is to listen to comment. If there's been a very substantial change in it such that, for instance, if it doubled in size or quadrupled in size, you might consider opening it up again. What they've done since the public hearing is actually reduce things. So I don't think there's any need for another public hearing to help inform you with your decision. The same issues have been in discussion since and during the public hearing, and that is the cubicle content, the size, the height, the square footage, all the things that you're supposed to take into account in determining whether or not you're going to approve this or whether or not it's excessively similar or dissimilar to the neighborhood, not across the street, but to the neighborhood, and also its impact on surrounding neighborhoods. So under Gary's interpretation, in order to help you with that determination under the ARB, he gave a very specific, detailed definition. And under that definition, you are interpreting the code, you are to consider the cubicle content as, the size of the building, the cubicle content is one of the elements. Gross floor area is another one, and the height of the building was the other one that he noted. And whether or not together they are something that is excessively similar or dissimilar in the neighborhood. And if you thought, for instance, that it was excessively dissimilar, you could actually approve it subject to conditions such as you need to shrink it by X amount, right? Or you could just outright deny it. But then you need to have more specific bases with respect to how it was excessively similar, dissimilar, or similar. So if you're fine with the way it is now, you can go ahead and approve the ARB. That's what this meeting is for. If you think that you need more information, you can ask the applicant to extend the time until a future meeting where you can have the time to consider it more, or you can approve it with modifications. Those are really your 3 basic ones.
Thank you,
Or
sir.
deny it all, all right?
So with that said, how does the board feel? Does the board feel we have enough information in front of us to finish hashing it out and come to a decision tonight? Or do we want something else from the applicant?
I think we have enough.
I think I'm good.
So you're okay because you're locking yourself into submission number 1?
It's the only submission.
Okay.
Right.
So there's no other questions on the application?
No.
Okay. And I can still use the ARB application from January 4th, correct?
Noting the materials and
The
everything.
materials
yes.
and everything, that's still, okay. So I guess with that said, well, I'll look for a motion for approval of the ARB application for the 26 Apple Hill Drive as submitted and discussed this evening.
I'll make that motion.
Do I have a second? I'll second. Sorry. I'll second, yeah. Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Next on the agenda for this evening, Dunnenberg Ventures. Discuss sketch plan submitted for proposal house of worship / school on 2 vacant properties and strip of land located between Route 17, the Quickway, and Ninninger Road near the intersection of Dunnenberg Road. Said property is known on the Village of Woodbury tax maps as sections 225, Block 1, Lot 17 and 18. We have a representative from the applicant here tonight.
Yes, Mr. Chair, good evening. My name is Daniel Richmond. I'm with the law firm Zarin and Steinmetz on behalf of the applicant. With me this evening on behalf of the applicant is Alex Goldberger and Jack Lieberman, and Larry Toro from Civil Tech Engineering is also here on behalf of the applicant. As you know, the project is located on an approximately 7.7 acre property located along Ninninger Road, between that and the access ramp for Route 6 westbound, near the intersection of Dunderberg Road and Ninninger, sort of along, if you follow Ninninger Road along where there's a new entrance to Woodbury Villas, goes along that side of the property. Property is located in the village's R2A zoning district where the proposed use is a permitted use by special permanent site plan approval pursuant to your board. As noted in your planner's memorandum, the applicant previously has proposed senior housing and offices in the area. In fact, the applicant has for 20 years tried to develop a commercial use on this property, but all the uses that would make the most sense, including office or senior housing, would either require a village code amendment or would require a use variance from the zoning board, and the village has signaled that those efforts are futile. The uses that are also permitted in this district that seem impractical in this, including things like forest improvement operations, outdoor recreation facilities, golf courses, riding academies, all impractical. So again, the uses that our client thought made the most sense and tried to pursue for 20 years that would generate taxes for the village have been apparently precluded by the village. So accordingly, this evening, after close consultation with religious leaders in the area and area residents, we're now proposing the instant house of worship, which will have 2 schools, one for boys and one for girls. To be clear, in response to the planner's memo, this is one use on one lot. There's not a proposed subdivision. For each building, again, while we are still in consultation with potential end user for this house of worship, who would ultimately be the applicant here. As of now, the concept plan is to have 2 buildings. Each would have a sanctuary on the ground floor. The girls' school would have an additional sanctuary auditorium. On the second floor, the boys would have the boys' school. That religious structure would have a ritual bath or a mikveh associated with it. The remainder of the space would be used for classroom space and associated staff space for office, lunchrooms, that type of use, as is typical for a religious use. Again, we're here tonight on a concept plan to get the board's initial take, recommendations. Right now, our initial review indicates that this project would be a low traffic generator, as the board likely knows, on religious holidays and on the Jewish Sabbath. Driving is prohibited under Orthodox law, so there would be no cars generated. During the week, when the school is used, students are anticipated to be traveling by bus. Moreover, under Orthodox law, women cannot drive, so they would also be anticipated to take the bus. And it's also traditional for rabbis or the teachers to accompany the students on the bus. So there would be few, if any, cars that would come to the site in addition to the bus traffic in the morning. The project does appear, because of the nature of the site, to require a couple of waivers from your board, including with respect to the rear yard setback. To be clear, the rear yard faces that Route 6 ramp I spoke about, and also the maximum coverage. As your planner notes in its memo, as the village code indicates, your board is authorized to grant waivers from the village code zoning bulk requirements when they would place a substantial burden on religious practice, as the controlling case law, including the seminal case from the Second Circuit on the Federal Religious Land Use and Institutional Persons Act, says a substantial burden essentially is anything that would interfere with an ability to construct an adequate religious facility. we'd respectfully submit that without the rear yard setback and the coverage grants, waivers, it would be infeasible to grant and to build an adequate facility. We'd also submit that those issues, the rear yard and the maximum coverage, do not affect public health, safety, and welfare, which under New York state law sets forth the parameters that your board would have. We're looking forward to working with your board on this. As your board certainly knows, greater flexibility is required when dealing with a religious land use application. Every effort is required to be made to accommodate it. So in that spirit, we're looking forward to hearing your comments this evening and discussing a path forward for how we process this application.
Thank you, sir, for the narrative.
Thank you.
You have both the planners and the engineers memos, correct?
We got one memo that seemed to be, is there another?
Should have been one from H2M and then from NP&V.
We didn't get a Nelson Pope memo. We got the H2M.
I sent the Nelson Pope memo to Toro.
Did you get them? I didn't see it. Okay.
If the board's okay, I'd like to go to the consultants first, as they do have a rather lengthy set of comments on the proposal in front of us. Mr. Lindsay, you're up.
The audio committee has met, and we're back online. I guess the initial question is, are these schools with accessory uses for places of worship, or are they places of worship with accessory schools?
It's our position that it's a house of worship with accessory schools.
All right, and are there floor plans inside that would, for that interpretation? The only reason I ask that is that we have a set of bulk regulations, and the degree to which the variances are approved or the degree to which the waivers are approved by this board would be a function of what it is interpreted as the principal use on the side. I don't think they're both principal uses. Okay. If they are two principal uses, let's just say if the school is the principal use, let me just double check that one. It is going to have, well, if they're both principal uses, then you're going to be required to get the relief for the most restrictive. And that reflects on what the waivers are to be. And if I understand this correctly now, you are asking for waivers from the board and not a referral to the ZBA for this use?
Yes, Mr. Lindsay.
All right. So we just would have to define that so that we can give the board what the waivers are. And then as far as the impact on the rights of your religious pursuits, generally we have some information submitted to the board in terms of schools, other areas, how this impacts it, and why this is an impact. And I'll defer to Rick on that. He'll probably give you more on that, but we need something on that. We've gone through various items in terms of setbacks, lot area, coverage. Those are all the waivers that would be requested by the applicant. After we get a definition on it, we can define those for you and tell you what the degree of request is. You can take a look at all those comments. I don't have to go through those. You can review those and provide the information that we need so we can clarify it for the board. In terms of site plan issues, we have a very basic site plan that shows a concept plan. I think that's what we defined it as. That's what I would call it. The amount of coverage, the amount of parking, the parking requirements, all of that will lead into how much coverage is there, and that impacts stormwater, what you're going to do on that. So we would need to look at all that. We've tried to give you bullet points on what we'd be looking at in terms of a site plan. I don't think there's anything unusual on that. And so we'll have to have more information before getting down into the details on that. And as you said, it's a process.
I understand that, Mr. I guess our client this evening is looking for initial feedback from the board on particular direction on this particular application before going to the next level, as you were indicating would be the next step, of course.
Okay. Unless you have any questions, that's all I have on the report.
Anybody have any questions for the village engineer?
For the village engineer?
Mr. Lindsay. Mr. Lockman.
Okay, whoa. Okay, our memorandum is from May 30th, and we really had some similar questions to the engineer. The school buildings, they're two separate school buildings, but we also were trying to think through the issue of, is the worship accessory to the school, or is the worship use a separate principal use, and how would that factor in on examining how many waivers you'd need, or whether you need variances from ZBA. Typically, well, it's defined, accessory is if you're subordinate in purpose and area, or if it's something customarily incidental. Schools, all schools have assembly areas, auditorium, or not necessarily for worship, could be for other types of assemblies. The typical situation is that an assembly area, a worship area, would be accessory to a school. But I guess we really need to know more about the operations before we can work on that
We can
issue.
certainly provide you more information, but I can think of a host of instances in which a house of worship has, classroom space associated with it, subordinate to it.
I guess it really just depends on the layout and the operation. And that in order to begin our analysis of what variances or what waivers you ought to request and what the board should process or attempt to process really comes from that. We noted that parking spaces aren't lined out on the drawings. We don't see any bus loading areas or any indications of how the traffic would circulate. And given the size of the schools, we'd need to look at how the buses would go in and out and where the staging would be for loading and unloading. Also, schools would require loading berths for deliveries and food as well under Section 31041. Then moving to our comment 8, the parking requirements go by there's parking requirements for school buildings based on one space for every 300 square feet of floor area. There's also parking requirements for places of worship as well, but if they were part of the school, they'd be subsumed into the school's parking requirement. But if they're a separate principal use, we'd have to look at the parking requirement for the school and have the parking requirement for the place of worship that's a separate principal use, a separate parking requirement. So that would make a big difference. Our comment 9 was about height. You didn't indicate the height in the text, but if you scale off the drawing and go up, it looks to be about 45 feet to the parapet, on the lower roof parapet on the flat roof. And if you go up 35 feet, you only get to the middle of the windows on the 3rd floor. So there's a sort of a mismatch between your text that says you're doing 35 feet or less and the drawings. So we would need some drawings that show the proposed building height according to the definition in the code. Our comment 10, parking spaces are shown backing out directly into travelways, which is considered unsafe and not a good practice. You'd want travelways and parking bays to have some separation. The current plan, or comment 11, doesn't show outside recreation areas. 12, landscaping isn't shown yet. These are all categories of things that we would want to see in later versions of the plan. As far as seeker process, I defer to the attorney on seeker details, because typically their office handles that, but if you're a non-residential facility over 100,000 square feet, this would be a type 1 action, and we would need a full environmental assessment form, part 1. And we would anticipate that the bus traffic issue would probably be of most concern during the seeker review. And we do have a lot of planned projects that are underway in the vicinity, shops at Woodbury that are going through this board right now. Woodbury Commons Phase 5, and then in Curious Joel, the VOL Moshe Gardens project, which feeds into Dunderberg Road, is under construction. So when we look at traffic impacts, we'll be looking at these other projects that are underway or in planning stages along the road there. And I guess one of the questions will be, and the attorney can address this, about whether, if you're going to go to ZBA, whether the planning board should be the lead agency in a coordinated review, or whether there should be uncoordinated review. But it sounds like you're going to try and structure the application to not do ZBA variances. So those are our questions and comments in our May 30th memo.
Thank you very much. Anybody from the board have questions for Mr. Walker? Go ahead, Rick.
Oh, okay. A couple of things. You've asked basically for some guidance from the board, and I'm going to caution the board at this point in time, not that it ought not to be weighing in very much with respect to the project at this time, because there's so much more information they need in order to put the information they have in context. As noted, there needs to be a full EAF form submitted. This will likely be a type 1 action, and I do recommend a coordinated review because of the various aspects, including the waivers, and if you later go for a variance, if you don't get a waiver or you don't get the waivers that you want, are very much intertwined with the uses that you're asking for. And so I think that a coordinated review is appropriate under these circumstances. But I think what we need is some more information for the board before it can really start to weigh in a substantive way. One of which is you need to be putting in writing a formal waiver request from each of the bulk requirements that you do not meet or cannot meet or desire not to meet, and identify those and make your argument that in fact this board has the ability and should, in your opinion, waive these things under the substantial burden test that's set forth in the bulk table. So that's one thing. That will, I think, allow the board to understand this project in a much more fuller way. The other thing is another fundamental issue that I think you need to explain more before the board can move forward on looking at this in a substantive way, is with respect to the uses. Now, you say this is, at one point you said it was one use, but I think you're saying that it's one principal use, which is the house of worship, and the schools are accessory to it. I mean, the other way around.
No, it's house of worship.
Oh, house of
correct,
worship,
the
okay.
school's accessory to it,
Right.
right.
I think you need to justify why you think that's the case. I mean, we all can think of houses of worship that have a school associated to it that's clearly accessory, and we also know of many schools that may have a small chapel where the religious house of worship is accessory to the school. So I think you need to go ahead and educate the board and the consultants on exactly the particulars of what the applicant is going to be doing here, so that the board can understand it. It may be when you do that, it's going to be very clear to the board one way or the other. It may be that it's not going to be very clear as to which is principal use and which is an accessory use, because that has implications under the code. The board may want to first get an opinion from the building inspector with respect to that issue, to be guided by it, because it's not up to the board to make the types of zoning decisions if it's not clear in the code as to which way it ought to be going. So I think you need to have a narrative with respect to that issue, and also identify all of the uses that you're talking about. This is the first time tonight, now I may be wrong, it's the first time tonight that I heard that a mikveh is going to be also included in there. So I think you need to be laying out everything that will be included in this application, and talk about the uses, principal, accessory, as well as the waiver information. So I think that the board really needs that kind of basic information before it can kind of weigh in as to their reaction to this and what way they think it ought to be going.
We appreciate the comments. Again, I think, I can think of a host of reasons why this is, the house of worship is the primary, including, as we explained this evening, but I understand you want it in writing, that exclusively on religious holidays and on the Sabbath, this would be used for a house of worship for the public. Again, and the classroom is meant to serve that house of worship. But again, we can put this all in writing and get you a deeper submission. If there are any other questions from the board, we're happy to answer them, because again, our client has tried for many years to develop this property, and we finally see this as the path forward.
No, I understand that. What I'm asking for is simply more information for the board to go ahead and understand it before they go ahead and start taking some actions with respect to it. But the board may have a bunch of questions that they want to ask. I would caution the board of not sort of indicating which way they're thinking about going at this point in time without the necessary information.
I know you weren't asked to prepare a report, but you said...
Can I, one more thing, yeah, because that's relevant. Dennis had indicated in his memo, and it was also discussed earlier, with respect to the traffic issues. Right now, you don't have a traffic consultant. I think that it probably makes sense that you bring on John as the traffic consultant, and he can go ahead, he probably can weigh in right now with some preliminary information that he would need that would also be helpful for you to sort of flesh out the project. But I think that you ought to indicate on the record that you're going to be appointing John as the traffic consultant, so you have the expertise of a traffic consultant for this application.
Do we need to make that as a motion, or?
For the record, I think it helps. It's not required, but I think it's helpful if you have it.
Okay. Then I'll offer a motion to make John Collins the traffic engineer for the project that's in front of us right now.
I second it.
Any question? All in favor?
Aye.
Tag, you're it.
I have a question for Rick.
We'll just let finish with the consultants, and then
Okay.
we'll come back to all of us.
I just have a
Get the mic down.
preliminary, and I've done a number of, I've done a number of schools, shuls, temples, etc. in Muncie, so I know what we're going to have to do. So the first thing we're going to need, has been asked, is a very clear narrative as to how this buildings are going to operate. Not only almost day by day. The questions I have that always come up is the fact that I'm dealing with a school. There should be the separation between the school bus drops, where the children are dropped off the bus, and the parking area. There should be clear separation. Secondly, the bus can't be backing up, has to make a complete complete movement. Are they going to be public buses, or are they going to be private buses? Are they going to be large buses, or are they going to be small buses? The site has to be able to take the fire apparatus in and out. And with respect to the sanctuary and the schools, there is somewhat of a dichotomy, because my understanding is for the sanctuary on the holidays and on the Sabbath, no driving is undertaken, and yet the children are being bused. So we're talking about substantial distances that the children are being bused, as opposed to walking on. So I don't know how we're going to take care of the Sabbath operation. We have to look at them separately, because there's two different types of operation. And then lastly, will the school and the sanctuary operate concurrently during the weekdays? Not on the Sabbath, not on the holy days, but let's say on a Monday or a Tuesday or a Wednesday, will the school and the sanctuary
During the
operating
week, the
currently?
intention is that the sanctuaries would be used by the students and the student body. There might be some evening classes for adult education, no more than
Okay,
5
but I
students.
won't have, in the building, children with the teachers and staff, and then outsiders coming into the building during school hours.
That's the program we're talking about
Okay,
now, right?
okay, fine. Those are my general comments, and also the number of students we anticipate.
Anything else from the consultants before I go to the board? And then keep in mind, council's advice, let's keep any questions that you have tonight, 10,000-foot view until we get more application from the applicant.
Rick, are religious schools under any regulations from the state Department of New York State, like a public school is, as far as building design and size of grounds and so forth?
The public schools have their own process with respect to building design, permitting with respect to building permits, building inspections, et cetera, all done by the state of New York. Contrary to popular opinion, the schools actually can be subject to zoning, but typically in New York, they aren't subject to zoning. To regular public schools is to coming in and presenting to you that they're going to be this far from setbacks, et cetera. That's as to public schools. Private schools, you do go ahead and your zoning code covers, and it's just like any other application with respect to that they have to comply with the zoning code. It's this particular use is allowed in this zone, and so you just look at the bulk requirements and the uses that there are, and then apply them to the site plan that's going to come before you. But because there are so many moving parts in this application, as similar applications, that's why I was suggesting that a very detailed narrative with respect to all the uses, including the traffic issues that John was just raising, I think will be helpful to you to sort of formulate in your mind. But this is completely subject to your requirements and zoning powers as a planning board.
Okay, thank you very much.
Anything else, Rob?
No, that's it.
Joe?
No, thank you.
Sandy?
I just have a couple of things. Rick, on the GML 239 that was sent in, on the first page for site plan, non-residential square foot proposed, it says 16,800. It doesn't mention the second building. And then on page 2, under site development, under use, it says house of worship and shul instead of house of worship and school.
I think that's a very good point. So I think what probably should be done is that when we get this much more detailed narrative of the use and any revisions to the site plan that you have, when you make that next submission, we will refer to the county at that time, and giving them more information and more accurate information as to what is being requested, including the waivers that are being requested, because typically, Dan, as you know, that if it went to the ZBA, they would have their own referral on variances, and the county comments on those as well. Here, you're choosing, at least initially, to go ahead and not go the ZBA route on variances, but a parallel route with respect to waivers. So I think the substance of the waivers, the basis for the waivers, should also be part of that 239 referral. So when you submit the narrative on that and the more specific uses that there will be, and also the waiver narrative, we can then go ahead, Sandy, and refer it at that time again to the board, to the county, so that they have more information. I think it's a good point.
Okay.
I think the source of that problem is that the drawings just showed two 16,800 square foot footprints, but then it said they'd each have three stories. If you multiply all that out and add it together, it comes out to be about a little over 100,000 square feet. So I think the next iteration of the application, we should have square footages of the gross floor area of the buildings, not just each footprint. And that gives a more realistic description of what's happening.
Footprint alone is some information, but it's not very helpful in understanding the scope of the project. You're going to have the square footage for each of the floors, has been noted. But you're going to put all that in the EAF as well, and you'll have we'll be able to send all of that to the county.
And then I want to make sure I understood you properly. Did you say that the applicant doesn't have, doesn't know who's going to be using this, or doesn't?
We are in discussions with a couple of groups that are interested in this for religious purposes. We're primarily talking with one. That's the program I've discussed with you this evening.
Okay, so it would be private, it wouldn't be incorporated into the Kairos Joel School District?
This would not be a public school. Right,
It's-
this would be a private school.
Okay, all right, that's all I have right now.
It's a nuanced point, but to Mr. Golden's point about private schools being subject to zoning, whereas public schools are not, I see the issue somewhat differently, that there's basically under zoning should be no distinction between public versus private. They should be treated similarly. But again, I think this is all handled under control and case law at Cornell, which counsels that the board and all boards need to accommodate religious and educational uses.
Right, I guess my question, depending on how you answered that, was going to be, if it was going to be incorporated into the Kairos Joel School District, how could it be in the Monroe-Woodbury, being built in the Monroe-Woodbury School
Yeah,
District?
it's a private school, private house of worship.
Okay, that's all I have right now.
Thank you.
No, I'm good.
I'm okay for now. I would imagine we're not in a position until we get more information to really move
anything.
forward as a board, correct?
Yeah, one of the fundamental documents that you need to move forward on seeker is the EAF, and so we need a full EAF Part 1 from the applicant. So I don't think that it even makes sense at this point in time to type it until you get that, and you just need more information, I think, before you can even understand the application better.
I got one. Are there minimum standards for a concept plan that should be presented?
Do you want to talk about it?
Yes, there are standards for a sketch plan. Quite frankly, I didn't go back to review that because this has been before the board a number of times, and because I wasn't understanding properly from the documents that were submitted whether it was a variance that was being requested or a waiver. When an applicant comes in and requests variances, generally the threshold is fairly low because they really don't have standing before here until they get the relief that they're seeking before the ZBA. In some municipalities, you can simply write to the building inspector, say you want to make an application for something that's at variance and get referred to the ZBA. There's an expense in coming before the board, so we don't usually press that issue. I didn't check that, but I would say this is probably in the range of what's required in a sketch plan. It's not that much, but the next step is more. It's a site plan. I didn't give them, and typically I do, attach to the memo the full list of requirements for site plan, but it's extensive and expensive. I think they want to get a little feedback from the board past some of these threshold issues before they actually develop a full site plan, and that's not unusual in the way applications are developed.
Anybody else?
I have a question. Is there a way of estimating the number of students between both schools, boys and girls?
At this point, I don't know that, the number of students. We'd have to give you that in our subsequent submission.
Okay.
All right, everybody good? You have any other questions for us? I think you've got some homework to do before you appear before us again. You have the consultant's memos. So,
We thank you for your time. We look forward to working with you on
all
this
right, thank you
application.
very much for your time tonight.
Now it doesn't even mention houses first.
It says that there's one in each school will have one entrance in there, but in here somebody says
Included with
All right, next on the agenda for this evening, Woodbury Common Expansion. Review public comments received on scope for draft supplemental environmental impact statement. Said property is located within the Woodbury Common Outlet Center off Route 32 and is known on the Village of Woodbury tax maps as Section 226, Lot 1, Lot 1, Lot 1, and Section 225, Block 1, Lot 70.2. Anybody here from the applicant tonight? Rick, the letters that we receive from the public, do those have to be read in, or can we just give copies to Gales and their parts?
It would be very unusual to actually read in the letters, all right? And sometimes people ask that they be read in, but there's no requirement for the board to do so. The board has read the letters, have been circulated there, have been circulated among the consultants, And anybody in the public that wants to know what their comments are, they can ask the planning board, the building department, and the building department will provide them. Having read them or not read them, they are of equal weight for purposes of being before the board.
Okay, thank you very much. Did you?
I did receive the
You did
comments.
receive copies, okay, good.
Should I put an appearance on the record, or is that?
Not required, but it's usually helpful if you...
No problem.
Sorry.
No problem.
You got here.
Jennifer Kanarick from Price Me Schulman and DeArmini on behalf of the applicant, commonly referred to as the Woodbury Commons. Just a point of note, I have with me my esteemed colleague and the brains of the operation, Mr. Lou Darminio of Price Me Schulman and Darminio. I also want to congratulate you on being appointed chairman, and I want to welcome Mr. Bigliano to the board. Looking forward to working with you on this project on the road. And I'll let you guys get to it.
As the board is aware, we left the public comment period open until May 30th for people to write in, email in. We were with the understanding that this board would review those comments. They would also review the transcript that was provided to us by Woodbury Commons, because right now we really have to flesh out any other additional items we'd like the Commons to put in the draft environmental impact statement before they get the red line back to us. 2 weeks, I think, right? It's our next.
That's the goal.
Right, that's the goal for our next meeting.
Correct.
So with that being said, we'll start down at the end again to Robert. With the having transcript and having what the other public comments that were received, is there any additional items you would like?
I'm just wondering, there's a few people that were concerned about the school across the way. And, if you look at the school across the way, we also have 3 schools. We have a middle school and a high school and one of our elementary schools. Significant bulk of the Monroe Woodbury population goes there. And there's some concern over noise and pollution and so forth. And I wonder whether we could address that as a separate category instead of just lumping it in just generally in the whole area. Is that possible to do that?
Yes, there can be a subcategory either all by itself or under each of those impacts. You can ask the applicant to put in the scope, and thereafter studying the DEIS. Let's say you have noise, and you talk about it generally, and then you'd have a subcategory that talked about specifically with respect to the schools. Yes, you can ask that. But if the board, the one thing I would say is that there are all these comments by the public. Some of them were very apt with respect to including things in the draft scope, which then have to be studied. There are other comments that simply posed objections to the proposal, which, although at some point in the future may be apt comments, at this point in time as to what should be studied, you're not making any determinations of we're not going to go forward with this, right? Because you have an obligation to go forward. So, but now is the time for you have the draft scope, you have the comments, and you have the written comments. If the board wants things studied differently than was in the draft scope previously, now is the time for you to direct the applicant to include that. So either, but it doesn't have to be by a formal motion, but I think there should be some discussion. If you want this, the way that we're talking about now, I think it's good to go ahead and discuss it yourselves and then direct the applicant to include it in that fashion.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I would like to see something about the effects on the schools that are across the street, particularly the elementary school, which will be the closest. I think it needs a separate study. I mean, there are probably positive and negative effects that this will have. So if you could explore both of those areas, I think that would be helpful for the public to see.
In relation to noise, or?
Well, I mean, as far as a positive thing could be, the tax impact, the contribution of taxes, or it could be employment of students, but a negative aspect could be pollution and noise, and,
But I think he's saying, do you want a separate category just for the schools where everything that's in the scoping, every item
category?
is studied for the school, but it's kept separate?
I would think separate. I think there should be a focus on that. I mean, after all, the school system is a major asset of the community. That's what drew a lot of people to Woodbury, the good schools, and I think it really needs to be studied in concern of some of the public.
If I could make a suggestion, I think you should identify the types of things that ought to be focused on, because obviously the bushes and the endangered species aren't going to be any different with respect to the school. So I think what you're talking about is maybe under some of these categories, including community benefits, and et cetera, there'd be a separate category with respect to school. With respect to noise, you wanted it to be a separate subcategory as the schools. With respect to traffic, I think there'd be a separate subcategory with respect to schools. Is there anything else that the board would want specifically with respect to schools?
I see you nodding your head. Go
Well,
ahead.
I was going to bring up the
Air
because-
quality, you can do air quality if you want to do air quality.
But there was a recent article in the newspaper about the new sports complex as far as the new fields and everything. So I think that the usage has to be looked into as far as how that's going to affect the traffic. I don't know, what Monroe Woodbury has in store for that, but if they're going to host major events there, then that traffic could definitely conflict with Woodbury Commons traffic.
And if I remember correctly, I believe the last meeting we did discuss studying the economic impacts, both negatively and positively, with relations to the police department and
Yep.
that. So I know
Already
we
have
did-
that down.
I know we did ask to bring that in.
Yep.
Just so I don't lose my train of thought, I know there was a comment that was received from the impact on the court system in relation to interpreters, because from what I was told, the things that happen, out of the commons control, but unfortunately, some crime does happen, and they do have to split the bill for extra interpreters, sheriff's officers, and that to handle that type of unwanted activity that just happens to take place in any retail establishment.
Understood.
I'm not trying to single you guys out, sorry, I'm trying to dance around that.
I understand.
So we'll have them put the noise in. I know we've already discussed with the helicopter. I think we wanted to study the noise, the flight patterns, and I think
Frequency?
frequency, and I think part of that will cover the impact of the noise to the school, because once they define flight patterns, then we'll know what kind of an impact they'll have over our children and stuff like that. So other than the noise and potential economic impacts as far as job creation, because I know there was some data that was thrown out there already in one of the local papers about 998 jobs or something like that would create for the local community. Anything else other than those couple of items?
Well, if I could just mention, piggybacking on what Sandy said, I think you need to look into, as part of your cumulative impacts, the potential that there's going to be some school expansion with respect to sports facilities and additional traffic as a result of that, buses, et cetera. So if you could look into that and determine what that is, I'm sure you can find out from the schools what their plans are.
Sure. Thank you.
You good? Joe? Sandy?
I just wanted to make sure, I know we had discussed it, but I don't know if it had to be formally put in as far as the name of the projects. I know Chris had brought up several different projects, and I think, John, you had said that they should be looked at, but do they have to be actually identified by name, or?
We identified the shops at Woodbury. We identified the gardens at Harriman. That was the two major. We were also, I forget the name of it. It's under construction right now up at Estrada, the mixed-use development. And then we're talking about the residential development that's going to be coming out of Curious Joel. I think the best way to do that, we discussed it because there's a number of them. I would say we have to look at roughly 2,000 units occurring in the time frame we're dealing with, and then assign those to the roadways to get the impact, and not specifically named, because there's a group of them, and some of them may get built faster, because the village has no control over how fast they get built. But if we put 2,000 units, I think we've done the best we can to date on their the impacts.
But now that we've listened to Dunderberg Ventures, should anything, as far as the buses?
I think what happens with them is the fact is that they're coming in and they're going to have to put on top of their analysis everything that's included under this analysis.
Okay,
So it's one step up the ladder, and then
Okay.
this is one level, and then the next level, if they come up and have to do the study, they have to take into account everything below them.
okay.
And we actually have to be careful what projects we name, because if we name a project that is not yet built or in front of the board, we're kind of there's
Approving
something
it, right.
approving that project without trying.
Oh, I see what you're talking about, okay.
No,
I forgot who made that comment, I think it was you, John.
Yeah, I think, and that's what I'm concerned about.
Okay.
I don't like to take a new project that's coming in, and the way we do it is we just, okay, they have to include
I understand what you're saying.
the expansion of our.
We don't even know if Dunderberg, I mean, we think they will, but we don't know that Dunderberg won't just go away tomorrow.
Right.
So I think what you usually do is having things that have approvals, or things that are very far along the way. Maybe they've in the middle of an EIS or something like that where it's moving along. But I think that, are you satisfied with the level in order for that to be included in the scope?
I think we look at 2,000 units, and what I've already started discussing with their traffic consultant is we may assign them to 3 major roadways and let them come out to 32 and see what the impact is. I mean, I think that's what the intent is, and let's see what it is.
Is that enough direction for you, Jennifer?
I believe so, and obviously our traffic consultant can work with Mr. Collins to, streamline what wording needs to actually go into.
Yeah,
That goes into the scope, right?
We're going to take them to 3 major roadways and then bring them down to 32 and then evaluate the corridor. So this way the board has an idea as to what the impact is of those residential developments on the corridor with and without this project, your project.
Understood.
I know I brought up about the impact on the court systems, that we'd just like to get that. I know we have one for the police department already, so let's just add the impact to the court systems there. I think I'm good, you're good, right, Sandy?
Yeah, I just had one question on traffic. I mean, I missed the last meeting. I'm reading the notes here. I missed the last meeting, but did the board ever come to a resolution with our traffic consultant about the digital simulation model as a living document with all these new applications within a 2 to 3 mile of the new interchange?
It's amazing you asked. I had that very conversation with your consultant the other day, and they are going to be taking the information from the state model, which is a very complicated system to work. They're going to be going into a synchro analysis that we've talked about. We've talked about the calibration, how that's going to be calibrated, and we have it available for the village to use in the future as other projects come on board.
So when there are a number of applications either before us being built. When do you think we're going to see the first simulation model and the different applicants that impact that new intersection? Just a rough idea, not a hard date, but.
Well, we're going to see it at least by the time the applicant submits their draft, okay? And I'm assuming that's going to be rather quickly, in a time frame. Now, maybe several months, but maybe we can get an early preview for that and make sure, because the first thing you have to do when you do the model, you have to make sure it calibrates. And we want to calibrate to what's the existing design is of the interchange area that's under construction. And once that calibration occurs, then it's easy enough to put additional traffic volumes into the model, such as the 2,000 units, such as the gardens and everything else. So maybe we get an earlier version. It's up to them when we can get it, but it's in the list.
And we're willing to work with your consultants as much as possible to get things as quickly as possible going forward.
I'm good.
Anybody else? I don't want to say last call, but, we want to kind of get the red line document. We want to give the Commons the time to work on it and get it back to us. Do you have any?
I do not. We have our charge. We know what we need to do. Just for clarification, these are the comments from the public on the record. Will we have any written comments from the public?
There were some written comments from the public.
Not the public, I'm sorry, the board.
Oh,
I
no.
misspoke. Okay,
No,
so
I
this
don't
is,
think anybody submitted anything, not a
Okay.
list of these.
okay.
Somebody's got
I
a
just
note
wanted-
they want to hand over.
There were comments tonight, there were comments at the last time.
Yeah, we have all that for the
Yeah.
transcript.
Right.
So you have the NPV's comments from May 14th then?
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
yes. I have all the consultants' reports, I have the board comments now, I have the public's written comments, and I think, and the transcripts, so we're ready to go. So when do you?
Is there anything in the transcript? I mean, because some of the transcript are the public's comments, and whether or not you need any specific direction from the board, whether or not they want to adopt or not adopt any of those specific comments from your point of view? Like anything that you were uncertain over as to whether or not you ought to include in the scope? Now I think it would be a good time to try to clarify that.
I think at this point, we were holding off on actually delving into the substantive of the public's comments. That being said, per the red line, we can obviously put in what we believe are the comments that should be addressed for the scope, and if there's additional comments that your consultants or you feel we missed or should be added because of the public's comments from the last meeting, we can obviously work together on that.
So just by way of a little bit of an explanation, because this is all different aspects of the same seeker process. Later on down the road, when you have a draft environmental impact statement and public comments, there's an obligation to take every single one of the public comments and respond to it in the FEIS. Okay, but that's not what this is here. And so what it is that the public has made some comments, the board's made some comments, and really from an applicant's point of view, they sort of make an educated guess as to what they think, based upon comments, was what the board wanted in there, right? So they're going to make that educated guess based upon the various comments, and they're going to leave some comments out and put some comments in. You'll receive a red line version, and the next one is going to be where you look at that, and if you thought that something in the public comments or something in your comments wasn't included that you want to include, that night will be your last opportunity to do that.
Can we assume at this point, though? I mean, I know there were some comments, like Mr. Powell had made a couple comments about the parking as far down as, on Buena Vista and Midland. I believe that was going to be taken into consideration as far as trying to alleviate how additional overflow parking ends up down in residential areas.
We do have a section in the document that addresses parking.
Okay,
Yeah.
and then his other, I think the biggest
And
one was
off-site
the buses.
parking as
And
well.
off-site, yeah.
Off-site parking,
Yeah.
yeah, and the buses.
That's the benefit of having a transcript
Yeah.
from the last meeting.
Yeah, well, that's why I just wanted to make sure we didn't have to,
Yeah,
reiterate it.
put it on the record, I
But
understand.
in reviewing the comments that the board received and the applicant received, there are some that are conclusions that an applicant doesn't want this because of this reason. That's not necessarily in a scope. The scope delves into the matter. It talks about the environmental consequences of doing this, what mitigations may be proposed. It will look at that in a different way instead of putting in a conclusion in the report. So
Right.
you won't, scope, you won't see that. That's the
Right.
only thing that's.
Okay.
We did receive one comment, a letter back from Metro North Railroad, and I know we've gone back and forth between interested parties and
Involved.
involved parties.
Southern Railroad or something.
Metro North is asking that they be added as an interested party for this environmental review. I don't know where we moved them. I know we moved people back and forth.
We did. I'll have to go back and look, but I will be as an interested party per the,
They're clearly an interested party.
Yeah.
They were listed as an interested party in the POSDEC, and should have been in the draft scope, and they will be in the new version of the draft scope.
correct.
Because they don't have any permitting, so they're not an involved agency, so they have to be an interested agency.
But in that letter, Metro North is also asking that you add Norfolk
I was just
Southern.
gonna
So there's-
piggyback onto that, yeah. So we'll add Norfolk Southern Railroad
catch.
as an interested party.
Correct.
Correct.
All right, that's that. Got feedback, consultants, anything else before? And the board, you guys, everybody's good here? All right. Looking forward to,
So let's just go over timing, so we have, we're all on the same page. So I believe at the last meeting, we had, we were shooting for December 12th to have the red line to the board and the professionals.
yes.
I mean, June.
What date?
I was gonna say
I heard
December.
what you said.
No, it's so hot in here, I'm starting to hallucinate. I'm wishing it
All of
were
a sudden, I was
cooler,
like, whoa,
I'm wishing it
I
were
heard
cooler
the
in
12th, I
here.
missed the month. Got plenty of time to look.
So June 12th for our submission of the red line,
Right.
To everybody.
to everybody, correct? And then the red line to be addressed on the June 19th meeting.
Correct.
Correct, and
Yes.
we did schedule, if needed, and with, if we get to go to the 26th on
a special.
On a special meeting in case we get
Yep.
caught up there.
I just wanted to make sure that still stood in terms of the
Yes.
timeline.
Yep.
Okay. That's all I have.
All right. Thank you very much for your time this evening.
Thank you. Take care. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Rick, can I close the meeting and go to attorney-client, or do I have to?
Yes.
Don't close the meeting.
Okay.
I have one item, it's not on the agenda. We received the Aldi's application for, not application, but documents for signature, so that I usually give to the chair to sign. We had written back to them and told them we saw a few discrepancies, a few changes, and they fixed things. But there were two items that they want to stay with the changes. I think they're field changes, but in my typical practice, I let you know about that and confirm that you believe it's a field change. Typically, I write you a letter, except for this came up this afternoon at 3:40. So I told them to send me an email because I want to hold them up on this, because I think they're very minor. One is they had windows in their elevation on the side of the building. I think there were, and I can show you. There were a series of windows. I guess there's probably 3 or 4 in a row, and then there were 3 or 4 separate windows. And they were fairly good height, about 4 feet in height by a fairly good length. What they've asked to do is for one of those sections, they want to make them sort of like skylight types, because they have casements inside that they're going to put up against that wall. And you'd be looking at the back of a bookcase or a storage cabinet for food. And so they think it would be better to have the windows along top. I'll show you the section view. That's
This is on
the
the
elevation.
loading dock dumpster side of
This
the
is
building.
right near that side, yes. Let me show the board. If I can stand. These were 4 windows here, and now they just want to have the top skylight. And that's it right there. These windows, there was a similar set here, and now they're on the top. So these windows were also over here, now this is the other side.
Yeah.
See that? Okay, that's one. And the other thing was on the dumpster, they were gonna have a chain link fence around it, but they would prefer to use square Trex decking boards for the doors, because it's a better appearance. And I think there's no problem with that.
It lasts longer probably than chain link fencing too.
So if you don't have any objection, I'll tell them to proceed as they feel.
Do you have to make a motion for that?
Do we need a motion for that, or?
Typically, you haven't, as long as it's in the record that the board gave its assent to go ahead and proceed with the changes as a field change.
Does anybody have any objections or comments on the field changes that Engineer Lindsay presented? Okay, everybody good?
Okay, and we'll proceed that way. Thank you.
And the board is going to proceed into attorney-client session, discuss a letter that we received from one of our applicants. With that, I will look for a motion to close.
I'll make that motion.
Second?
Second.
Is that Joe?
Yeah.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you very much.